welcome to you all from wherever you are in the world to our first webinar series where I'll talk about newspapers and bias. Have you ever listened to a news story and thought it sounded one-sided? Or have you thought the news didn't seem to report the whole story or the most important aspect of a story? This is called media bias and happens in any form of media, but especially in newspapers, where bias is easily detected. To start with, I'll describe the types of bias: conservative and liberal. Then I'll explain the several forms in which bias occurs. Finally, I'll give you some advice on how to recognize bias in a newspaper. Let's begin with the definition of bias. I want to make sure everyone understands what we are talking about when we say bias, as this is one of the major topics of today. Bias is the skewed presentation of a story from a particular ideological position. There are two general types of bias. The name conservative or liberal is used to describe political and economic views and affiliations. The meaning of conservative or liberal could be different in different contexts: social, economic, and political. They also differ in usage in different countries and over time. To explain the difference between these two, the next chart shows the main ideas of each of them. When it comes to political views, conservatives prefer smaller government, less regulation, most services to be provided by the private sector in a free market, and a literal interpretation of the Constitution, while liberals prefer more regulation and services, like free universal health, to be provided by the government to all citizens. On economic views, conservatives agree that the government should tax less and spend less. On the other hand, liberals agree that the government should provide more services to the less fortunate, like healthcare, and increase taxes if necessary. When it comes to social views, conservatives are opposed to gay marriage, abortion, and embryonic stem cell research, and support things like death penalty, for example. While liberals believe that gay couples should get equal rights like everyone else, and basically support the ideas conservatives don't. On personal responsibility, the first ones agree that individuals should exercise personal responsibility, and it is the government's role to hold them accountable even with severe penalties. Laws are enacted to reflect the best interest of the society as a whole. While the second ones agree that people should look to the government to provide a structure, laws are enacted to protect every individual for an equal society, sometimes at the expense of economic freedom if necessary. The most glaring example of biased articles when discussing economics appeared on 2010 in the top stories of the United States' most respected newspapers. Each claimed to be informing readers of a troubling trend in big money politics. On one hand, we have the New York Times. Apart from knowing that this newspaper is liberal, this can be seen in the header. On the other hand, we have the Wall Street Journal, which is a conservative, but this is as well immediately seen in the header. As I explained before, conservatives say that the government should spend less and tax less, while liberals think that the government should provide more services to the less fortunate and increase taxes if necessary. The second newspaper illustrates this idea of the not spending as writing the campaign's big spender, as opposed to the first one. A reporter's job is to present a balanced story. As you read, listen to, and watch the news, you may notice stories that you think are biased. To see if they really are, you need to determine if the story falls into at least one of the several forms in which bias occurs. The next 6 point consider biases in terms of political agenda. The first one is bias by omission, means leaving one side out of an article or a series of articles over a period of time, ignoring facts that tend to disprove liberal or conservative claim or that support liberal or conservative beliefs. The next one is bias by selection of sources, which means including more sources that support one view over another. This bias can also be seen when a reporter uses such phrases as experts believe or most people believe. When a news story only presents one side, it is obviously the side the reporter supports. The following point is bias by story selection, a pattern of highlighting news stories that coincide with the agenda of either the left or the right, while ignoring stories that coincide with the opposing view. For example, printing a study released by a liberal group, but ignoring studies on the same topics related by the opposing group. Another type is bias by placement. Story placement is a measure of how important the editor considers the story. When reading a newspaper, most people read only the headline. Bias by placement is where on a newspaper a story is printed, a pattern of placing news stories so as to downplay information supportive of either conservative or liberal views. The next type is bias by labeling. It comes in two forms. The first one is the tagging of conservative politicians and groups with extreme labels while leaving liberal politicians and groups unlabeled, or vice versa. The second kind of bias by labeling occurs when a reporter not only fails to identify a liberal as a liberal or a conservative as a conservative, but describes the person or group with positive labels, such as an expert. When doing it, the reporter imparts an air of authority that the source does not have. If the expert is properly called a conservative or a liberal, the news consumer can take that ideological inclination into account when evaluating the accuracy of an affirmation or an information that this person has given. The last type is bias by spin. It occurs when the story has only one interpretation of an event, to the exclusion of the other. Spin involves the tone. It's the reporter's subjective comments about objective facts makes one side's ideological perspective look better than another. The next 4 points considers biases not in terms of political agenda, but in terms of a philosophy regarding what counts as news and what people need or want to consume as news. The first informational bias of the news is personalization. This is when an article focuses not in institutions but in individuals. This focus is designed to make stories feel more personal, but by doing it, people are encouraged to view certain issues individually rather than socially. For example, when writing about economic recession, focusing on the president. Then, people will blame this political actor for a social problem. The next one is dramatization. The news is biased toward a narrative presentation of information. It is told as a story, and it usually focuses on the sensational details of a story. As a consequence, it leads to inaccurate reporting, and as stories have a beginning and conclusion, dramatized news have the potential to impose a clean sense of closure on complex, enduring issues. The following one is fragmentation, which means to treat stories in isolation, ignoring the larger context in which they occur. This occurs in front page of a newspaper, for example, where only the headlines are portrayed, and usually these headlines may not match the rest of the article. The final informational bias of the news is authority disorder, and is the way in which personalized news become dramatized. Now we will move on to detecting bias in a newspaper article. Media have tremendous power in setting cultural guidelines and in shaping political discourse. It is essential that news media, along with other institutions, are challenged to be fair and accurate. The first step in challenging biased news is documenting the bias. There are a few steps you might want to follow to detect bias in a newspaper article. The first one is to research the information and also research the newspaper. Some papers have a reputation for giving a particular slant on the news, in addition to the news itself. Then you should also take notes as you read the article. Identify who, what, when, where, why, and how, and make note of any missing information or extra analysis. Next, you might want to see if you could rewrite the article using the same information to tell a completely different story. Then look at how the writer treats the people he is writing about. Do some sources claim their stories while others explain them? Make notes of language that gives you a positive or negative feeling about a piece of information, but which represents the writer's opinion and not a verifiable truth. Also, do stereotypes skew coverage? Sometimes journalists tend to focus almost exclusively on a particular part of the society, just because stereotypes define this part in some way. You should also pay attention to the overall tone of the article. What you feel relates to the information or the writer's opinion. Also, you should ask yourself, what's missing from the article? Is there a source, witness, or explanation that has obviously been ignored? Then you should also watch for buzzwords. These are vaguely defined terms like the Christian agenda that tend to evoke an emotional reaction without giving you any real information. The language chosen may give people an inaccurate impression of the issue. The next thing to do is to recognize if the writer tries to identify with you or labels you or other. By asking you to identify with a group mentality, such as working class, Christians, teens, moms, the writer may be expecting you to forget to think of yourself. Then observe the placement of the stories. The stories on the front page are considered to be more important than the stories in the back, and they will have the greatest influence on public opinion. Afterwards, you should consider how people are portrayed through pictures. A photo can make someone look good, bad. Ask yourself, what impression does this photo imply about this person? The following point is to look for at least two sides to every story. A good reporter will allocate adequate space in the story to present facts and figures supporting all sides of an issue. Then, if statistics are provided or studies are mentioned, investigate deeper on where did those statistics and studies came from, and on who collected or conducted them. Then, you should learn to recognize press releases. Corporations regularly issue press releases to distribute their side of an issue or story to the media. Some media outlets reprint these releases as news without doing any investigative journalism. Press releases tend to have an introductory paragraph followed by a single quote from an accompanying executive. To conclude, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I hope you have enjoyed it. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask me Don't hesitate to ask me any question you have. You can either leave it in the section below this presentation, or you can send it to my email, which is m_finkelsztein@columbiauniversity.com. Thank you.